Hey guys, tonight we are heading back, way back, to a time when your social standing, your very essence, might just be judged by the mountain of powdered hair teetering precariously atop your head. Picture yourself for a moment. You're strolling, or perhaps trying to elegantly navigate, a bustling, slightly grimy 18th century street. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke, roasting meats, unwashed bodies, and, if you're near a bakery, the heavenly aroma of fresh bread, a confusing but vibrant perfume. Towering over almost everyone, sometimes literally, are these elaborate wigs, architectural wonders of human and, well, other hair. Frankly, with the sanitation standards back then, and the sheer faff involved, you probably wouldn't survive this era with your sanity or your scalp intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel out, more than a cleverly placed mouse in a peruke, or so I'm told. Go on, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping carefully over the cobblestones, uneven and slick in places. The clatter of iron-shod carriage wheels on these stones is a constant soundtrack, punctuated by the shouts of street vendors hawking everything from fresh oysters to remedies of dubious efficacy. It's a world teeming with life, with energy, and with a certain robust aroma that a single sniff would tell you is uniquely pre-industrial revolution. It's not all bad, of course. From an open window drifts the faint melody of a harpsichord, a little island of refined sound in the general hubbub. Ladies, their wide skirts somehow navigating the narrow, crowded pathways, pass by with elaborate fans that do more than just stir the air. They communicate. Gentlemen, their coats rich with embroidery if they can afford it, offer curt bows. And above it all, literally, are the wigs. They are everywhere, these magnificent, sometimes monstrous constructions. From the relatively modest tie wig of a diligent clerk, to the full-bottomed cascading periwig of a wealthy merchant or aristocrat, hair, or rather the appearance of magnificent hair, reigns supreme. It was the French court, particularly under Louis XIV in the late 17th century, that really cemented the wig as a non-negotiable accessory for any man of standing. The Sun King, experiencing premature hair loss, embraced wigs with such gusto that his courtiers, and then the rest of fashionable Europe, quickly followed suit, setting the stage for the explosion of styles you see all around you in this 18th century city. So yes, you can partly thank royal pattern baldness for generations of elaborate headwear. The allure, you ponder. What is it really about these towering tresses? It's more than just covering a thinning pate, though that certainly plays its part for some. No, this is about declaration. It's about shouting your status, your taste, your very identity from the rooftops, or at least from a few feet above your actual scalp. You see a particularly ostentatious creation approaching. A confection of white powder, curls, and possibly even miniature decorations woven within its structure. The gentleman beneath it moves with a practiced, almost theatrical grace, as if the wig itself dictates his posture. And in a way, it does. These aren't lightweight, throw-on-and-go accessories. Some of the grander designs, particularly those favored by the macaronis, those extravagantly fashionable young men of the mid-century, could be so tall and elaborate that they famously had to carry their hats on the ends of their walking sticks because they simply wouldn't fit over the mountainous coiffure. Imagine trying to get through a doorway without looking like a surprised giraffe. The sheer artificiality is part of the appeal. In an era where nature is being tamed in grand formal gardens, why not tame and sculpt hair into equally unnatural but impressive forms? There's a sublime confidence in wearing something so obviously crafted, so divorced from the messy reality of natural hair. It speaks of leisure, of money, these things weren't cheap, and of a commitment to being a law mode. You notice the variations. The severe, almost militaristic look of a campaign wig, tied back neatly. The softer, more scholarly feel of a barrister's wig, already taking on its iconic shape. The elaborate sausage curl arrangements favored at court. Each one tells a story, a silent broadcast of profession, rank, and aspiration. Historians still argue whether the sheer expense and time invested in these wigs reflected a societal need for visible markers of hierarchy in an increasingly complex world, or if it was a more artistic, expressive impulse simply running wild. Perhaps it's a bit of both. The scent of hair powder is almost a constant in the air around fashionable folk. A mix of starch, sometimes with a hint of plaster of Paris for structure, and perfume. You catch a whiff of lavender, or maybe orris root, as a finely dressed lady is assisted from her sedan chair. Her own hair is likely cropped short beneath that towering, powdered masterpiece, itself possibly augmented with wool, goat hair, or even plant fibers to achieve the desired volume. It's a world of illusion, certainly, but an illusion maintained with incredible dedication and expense. The craftsmanship required to create these wigs, to make them sit just so, to curl and powder them to perfection. It's an art form in itself, supporting a whole industry of artisans. And as you wander these bustling, noisy, and oddly fragrant streets, you can't help but be mesmerized by the sheer, unapologetic spectacle of it all. It's a long way from a baseball cap, that's for sure. You see a dog, a scruffy terrier, sniffing at a discarded bit of something in the gutter, blissfully unaware of the tonsorial drama unfolding just above its head. The contrast makes you smile. Now you're probably thinking, with all that effort and expense, why on earth would anyone subject themselves to wearing a wig, day in and day out? It wasn't just a whim of fashion, though fashion, as always, played a starring role, darling. The 18th century wasn't exactly a golden age of personal hygiene by our modern, obsessive standards. Remember how we used to think crocodile dung made for good sunscreen back in ancient Egypt? Well, 18th century attitudes towards cleanliness, especially hair care, were different. Bathing the entire body was an infrequent event for many, sometimes viewed with suspicion, even believed to be unhealthy if done too often. Washing hair? Even less frequent. Shampoo as we know it didn't exist, and the concoctions used to clean hair could be harsh, ineffective, or both. So your own natural hair, if left to its own devices for long enough, could become a rather greasy, smelly, and potentially pest-ridden affair. A not-so-fun fact. Syphilis was rampant, and one of its unpleasant symptoms was hair loss, sometimes patchy, sometimes extensive. Wigs, therefore, offered a very practical solution to concealing this rather telltale sign of the disease, allowing sufferers to maintain a semblance of public respectability. Beyond the practicalities of covering hair loss, whether from illness or just genetics, wigs offered a compelling social advantage. As we glimpsed, a wig could instantly signify your station in life. A simple, unpowdered bob wig might belong to a tradesman or a clerk. A more elaborate powdered peruke indicated a gentleman of leisure, a professional, or a man of wealth. Lawyers and judges had their specific styles, instantly recognizable, just as clergy might adopt more sober, less ostentatious versions. Think of it as a uniform, but far more complicated and far, far itchier. This visual language of wigs helped maintain social order, reinforcing the hierarchies that structured society. You knew, at a glance, who you were dealing with, or at least, who they wanted you to think they were. The ability to purchase and maintain a fashionable wig was a clear demonstration of disposable income, a way to quite literally wear your wealth on your head. Then there's the rather significant issue of head lice. Oh yes, those delightful little creatures were an extremely common problem, a shared misery across all social strata, though the wealthy could perhaps afford more concerted efforts to combat them. Having your own hair infested was uncomfortable, embarrassing, and relentlessly itchy. Shaving your head or cropping your hair very short and then donning a wig was a surprisingly effective anti-louse strategy. Your scalp was much easier to keep clean and delouse if necessary, if it was relatively bare. The wig, of course, could also become infested. We'll definitely get to that peculiar horror in a bit. But it was, in theory, an external garment that could be removed and treated, rather than your own hair being the constant battleground. This gave rise to the image of people vigorously scratching their heads, often with specially designed elegant scratchers. Long, thin rods, sometimes with a tiny carved hand on the end, that could be discreetly, or not so discreetly, inserted beneath the wig to relieve an itch. Imagine having an itch you simply can't reach under layers of powdered horsehair. The relief must have been exquisite. The notion of necessity also extended to professions. For certain careers, a wig wasn't just fashionable, it was virtually mandatory. You wouldn't find a barrister pleading a case in court without the proper wig, nor would a physician attending a wealthy patient likely appear without one. It conveyed an air of gravitas, of tradition, of learned authority. Even if you had a perfectly splendid head of natural hair, conforming to the professional expectation of wig wearing was crucial for your career. Historians still argue whether this professional adoption of wigs was primarily about emulating the aristocratic elite, or if it stemmed from a genuine belief that the wig itself lent an air of wisdom and impartiality. Regardless of the root cause, the effect was the same. Fields like law, medicine, and academia became strongholds of wig-wearing long after the peak of fashion had passed. And let's not forget the sheer transformative power of a wig, for those who are not blessed with thick, luxuriant locks. And let's be honest, that's most people. A wig offered the chance to present an idealized version of oneself. It was the 18th century equivalent of a really good filter, but in 3D and made of animal hair. In an age that valued artifice and the taming of nature, a perfectly coiffed wig was the ultimate expression of control over one's appearance. You could change your hairstyle dramatically without any commitment, simply by swapping one wig for another. Got a hot date? Maybe the full-bottomed periwig. Off to the coffee house for intellectual debate? Perhaps the more practical Ramillies wig. It was a level of versatility that natural hair simply couldn't offer, especially not with the limited styling products and techniques of the time. It's kind of like how people today might have a work persona and a weekend persona, but expressed through scalp architecture. You see a group of young apprentices, their own hair short and unpowdered, hurrying past. They eye the elaborate wig of a passing gentleman with a mixture of aspiration and perhaps a touch of youthful derision. For them, a good wig might be something to strive for, a symbol of having made it, but for now, their concerns are more immediate. The street is getting busier as midday approaches. The aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart mingles with the ever-present coal smoke and the distant, unsettling tang of the slaughterhouses further down by the river. Life here is a full frontal assault on the senses, and the wigs, in their own strange way, are part of that vibrant, if sometimes overwhelming, tapestry. The effort involved, the societal pressure, the surprisingly logical reasons behind covering one's natural hair. It all starts to paint a picture of a world very different from our own, yet driven by some of the same fundamental human desires: to fit in, to stand out, and to avoid a chronically itchy scalp. So where did all this hair come from? We're talking about a continent, even a world, obsessed with voluminous wigs, demanding an almost unimaginable quantity of raw material. You couldn't just pop down to the local hair emporium and pick up a few ethically sourced wefts. The sourcing of wig hair was a complex, often quite grim business, relying on a vast network that spanned from peasant villages to the grimmest corners of society. Think about it. Every wig, from the grandest peruke to the most modest bob, required a substantial amount of hair, carefully selected for length, color, and texture. The demand was relentless. A primary source, especially for the finer, more expensive wigs, was, unsurprisingly, human hair. Young women, often impoverished, would sell their long tresses for a much-needed sum of money. These hair harvests might occur at fairs, or agents might travel through rural areas, quite literally buying hair off people's heads. There's a certain poignancy to the image. A young peasant girl, whose only real asset might be her thick, healthy hair, parting with it to provide a luxurious adornment for someone far removed from her daily struggles. The best quality hair, often called maiden hair because it had supposedly never been cut or treated, fetched the highest prices. Blonde and light brown hair were particularly prized, as they were easier to bleach and dye to achieve the fashionable pale shades, though natural white or gray hair from older individuals was also valuable for creating those distinguished, powdered looks without the need for excessive powdering. The color matching was an art in itself. Imagine trying to gather enough hair of a consistent shade to create a full, flowing wig. It wasn't like you could just order Pantone Color 12, 0712 bleached ash by the kilo. But human hair alone couldn't satisfy the insatiable demand, especially for the sheer volume required in some of the more architectural creations, or for the less expensive everyday wigs. This is where things get a bit more farmyard. Horsehair, particularly from the mane and tail, was a very common component. It was strong, wiry, and held a curl well, making it ideal for the underlying structure of wigs, or for the entirety of cheaper ones. Goat hair was another popular choice, prized for its fineness, and sometimes even yak hair found its way into the mix, imported from distant lands. A lesser-known fact is that some wig makers even used cowtails, and rather surprisingly, the hair of certain breeds of long-haired dogs. The art lay in blending these various animal hairs, processing them, and making them appear as human-like as possible. One can only imagine the olfactory landscape of a wig maker's workshop. Not exactly Chanel No. 5. The collection process for animal hair was, as you might expect, less about gentle persuasion and more about utility. Horses were clipped, goats shorn, and other animal byproducts from slaughterhouses would also yield their hairy bounty. This mixture of materials meant that the quality of wigs could vary enormously. A wealthy nobleman's wig might be composed almost entirely of prime human hair, soft and lustrous, while a tradesman's more utilitarian piece might be a robust, if slightly scratchier blend of horse and goat. You could often tell the quality by the feel, the luster, and perhaps even subtly, the smell. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of animal hair was openly acknowledged by fashionable wearers, or if there was a polite fiction maintained that all wigs were of pure human origin. Given the human tendency for status symbols, it's likely the latter played a significant role. And what about color? The fashionable ideal for much of the 18th century was a powdered white or gray look. This meant that naturally light-colored hair was highly sought after. Darker hair, whether human or animal, needed to be bleached. This was typically done using harsh chemical treatments, such as soaking the hair in alkaline solutions like lye, or by exposing it to sulfur fumes. These processes were not only damaging to the hair itself, making it brittle, but also undoubtedly unpleasant and potentially hazardous for those carrying them out. Once bleached, the hair could then be powdered to achieve the desired uniform whiteness, or, for certain styles or professions, dyed. Dyes were derived from natural sources. Walnut husks for browns, indigo for blues, though blue wigs were more a theatrical or masquerade item than everyday wear, and various concoctions for other shades, though white and off-white remained dominant for formal wear. You see a cart rumble by, piled high with sacks. You don't need to ask what's in them. The faint, slightly musky, and decidedly organic aroma that trails behind it is a dead giveaway. It's raw hair, heading for a workshop somewhere in the city. The sheer industry involved in sourcing, processing, and distributing this fundamental raw material is staggering. Entire communities might become known for hair farming, their women's long locks a regular cash crop. Think of the logistics, collecting the hair, sorting it by length, color, and quality, cleaning it, a process that involved boiling and combing to remove dirt, and ideally, any lingering inhabitants, and then transporting it, sometimes across borders, to the urban centers where wig makers plied their trade. It's a hidden supply chain, vital to the entire edifice of 18th century fashion, and one that relied on the poverty of some to adorn the vanity of others. It's a slightly uncomfortable thought, perhaps, as you admire a particularly voluminous and impeccably white wig on a passing magistrate, its curls bouncing with an almost animate quality. The journey those strands have taken is likely far longer and more complex than the journey of the man beneath them. The foundation of high fashion often rests on a less than glamorous reality, doesn't it? A bit like finding out your favorite fancy cheese is aged next to someone's old socks. Now that we've corralled the necessary tresses, human, horse, goat, or perhaps even a dash of distinguished dog hair, how did these raw materials transform into the elaborate architectural wonders you see parading down the street? The craft of the 18th century wig maker, or perruquier as they were known in France, a term that lent an air of artistry, was a highly skilled and painstaking affair. It wasn't just a matter of slapping some hair onto a cap. It was a detailed, multi-stage process that required precision, patience, and a good eye for form. First, the raw hair, having been sourced and given an initial, rather aggressive cleaning. Remember that boiling process needed further preparation. This involved meticulous combing and carding to untangle the strands and align them. Different lengths of hair would be sorted and bundled. If the hair wasn't already the desired color, this was the stage for bleaching or dyeing, those often pungent chemical baths we touched upon. The hair would then be drawn, pulled through a series of increasingly fine-toothed hackles. Think of them as very sturdy, sharp combs mounted on a board, to ensure all the strands were perfectly parallel and to remove any shorter, unsuitable hairs or impurities. This was crucial for achieving a smooth, uniform look in the finished wig. One rather curious detail. Wig makers sometimes used a fine dusting of grease or oil like mutton tallow during this process to help manage the hair and give it a slight sheen. Not exactly the argan oil treatment we're used to. The foundation of the wig, the part that actually sat on the head, was typically made of a fine net or a framework of silk or linen ribbons, carefully constructed to fit the client's head measurements. These caps, often called cauls or coiffes, had to be sturdy enough to support the weight of the hair, but also breathable enough to prevent the wearer's head from becoming a total sweat lodge, though some level of perspiration was probably unavoidable. Wealthier clients would have their cauls custom-made, measured precisely for a comfortable and secure fit. You can imagine the fitting sessions, with the wigmaker fussing with tapes and calipers around a client's skull. For less affluent customers or for ready-made wigs, more generic sizes would suffice. Once the foundation was ready, the real artistry began, attaching the hair. This was typically done using a technique called wefting, or knotting. Small bundles of prepared hair were meticulously knotted, stitch by stitch, onto the threads of the net foundation, or onto the ribbons. This was incredibly time-consuming work, demanding nimble fingers and intense concentration. Each knot had to be secure, yet lie flat, to create a natural-looking distribution of hair. The direction and density of the knotting would vary, depending on the style of the wig being created. For example, the crown of the wig might require hair to be knotted in a way that allowed it to stand up and create volume, while the sides might be knotted to flow downwards. A truly high-quality full wig could contain tens of thousands of individual knots, each one tied by hand. Imagine the eye strain. It makes my shoulders ache just thinking about it. After the hair was knotted onto the foundation, the wig began to take shape, but it was still a rather floppy, unkempt affair. The next crucial step was styling. This often involved setting the hair in curls, which was achieved using heated clay or metal curlers, and then baking the entire wig in a specialized oven, or sometimes even just a heated box. This baking process helped to set the curls permanently, or at least semi-permanently. Different sizes of curlers would produce different types of curls, from tight ringlets to looser waves. The famous sausage curls often seen in military or formal wigs were a hallmark of this baking technique. Historians still argue whether the prolonged exposure to heat during baking significantly degraded the hair quality over time, leading to a shorter lifespan for frequently restyled wigs. Given the organic nature of the materials and the relatively harsh treatments, it seems highly plausible. The final shaping involved cutting and trimming the hair, thinning it in places, and artfully arranging the curls and rolls according to the desired fashion. Perhaps the Ramillies plait, the Cadogan loops, or the towering heights of a lady's poof. This was where the wigmaker's skill as a stylist truly shone. It wasn't just about creating volume. It was about creating a balanced, aesthetically pleasing silhouette. This is also when pomatum, a greasy, waxy substance, often made from rendered animal fat, like bear grease or pig lard, scented with perfumes like lavender, ambergris, or bergamot, would be applied to the hair to help hold the style, give it shine, and prepare it for powdering. Think of it as 18th century superhold hair gel, but with a much more organic base. You pass a wigmaker's shop. Through the window, you glimpse a craftsman hunched over a wooden wig block, his brow furrowed in concentration, as he carefully adjusts a curl on an almost finished peruke. Rows of other blocks, some bare, some crowned with half-finished creations, line the shelves. The air drifting from the slightly open door carries a faint, complex scent, a mixture of warm hair, singed pomatum, and something vaguely chemical. It's not unpleasant, just distinct. You see tools of the trade, combs of various sizes, curling irons, tong-like implements heated in a small charcoal brazier, scissors and small pots presumably holding pomatum or dyes. It's a world of meticulous, hands-on craftsmanship, a far cry from mass-produced synthetic wigs. Each piece was an individual creation, reflecting not only the prevailing fashion, but also the skill and interpretation of the wigmaker. It makes you appreciate the sheer labor that went into every one of those seemingly effortless coiffures gliding by you on the street. No wonder these things were expensive. It's a little like appreciating hand-thrown pottery over something stamped out by a machine. There's a human touch, an imperfection that makes it perfect. Once your magnificent custom-made wig was complete, a masterpiece of knotted hair, carefully baked curls, and fragrant pomatum, the work wasn't over. Oh no. Maintaining that pristine, fashionable appearance was a daily ritual, a commitment that involved more powder, more perfume, and, as you might guess, more potential problems. This wasn't a low-maintenance hairdo. Think of it as adopting a very demanding, very hairy pet that lived on your head. The most visible aspect of daily wig care was, of course, powdering. That iconic white or gray look, so emblematic of the 18th century, was achieved by applying copious amounts of fine powder to the wig. The powder itself was usually made from finely milled starch. Wheat starch was common, but rice, potato, or even bean flour could be used. Sometimes, for a brighter white or to add stiffness, powdered plaster of Paris or kaolin clay was mixed in. You can imagine the fun of inhaling that on a regular basis. To add a touch of luxury, and to mask any less than luxurious underlying odors, the powder was often scented with fragrant oils or powdered botanicals, lavender, orange blossom, violet, orris root, even jasmine. This aromatic cloud was an essential part of a well-dressed individual's personal atmosphere. The powdering process itself was often quite elaborate. For men of means, it would typically be done by a valet. The gentleman would sit in a special powdering closet or simply drape a protective gown over his clothes, sometimes holding a cone-shaped mask of paper or leather over his face to avoid inhaling too much of the stuff. The valet would then use a bellows or a brush to apply the powder liberally, ensuring every curl and crevice was coated. It must have looked like a miniature snowstorm, localized entirely around one person's head. For women, whose hairstyles, even when involving wigs or substantial hairpieces, could be even more complex, the powdering process was equally, if not more involved, often undertaken by a lady's maid. A contemporary satire described a powdering room, where the mistress and the maid are generally involved in a cloud of white dust. No kidding. Beyond the aesthetics, the pomatum and powder served a somewhat practical, if slightly gross purpose. The greasy pomatum helped the powder adhere to the hair, and the powder, in turn, helped to absorb oils and dirt, freshening the wig between more thorough cleanings. It was essentially an 18th century dry shampoo, albeit a very heavy-duty one. However, this buildup of grease and starch also created its own set of issues. Over time, the wig could become stiff, sticky, and discolored, the once fragrant perfumes mingling with stale body oils and accumulated grime to create a rather unique bouquet. Remember the delightful crocodile dung sunscreen? The hygiene standards here aren't wildly different in some respects, just powdered over. The perfuming wasn't just about smelling nice, it was also about olfactory camouflage. In an era of infrequent bathing and limited plumbing, body odors were a fact of life. The strong scents of wig powder and personal perfumes helped to mask these, creating a more socially acceptable miasma around the wearer. Civet, musk, and ambergris, all derived from animal sources and quite potent, were popular base notes in 18th century perfumery, often blended with lighter floral or citrus essences. Your wig wasn't just a visual statement, it was an olfactory one too, broadcasting your commitment to the fashionable and hopefully fragrant ideal. Of course, all this goo and powder eventually needed to be dealt with. Wigs required regular cleaning and redressing to maintain their shape and freshness. This wasn't something you'd typically do at home unless you were truly down on your luck. Most people would send their wigs back to the wig maker for professional servicing. The process involved carefully combing out the old powder and pomatum, a messy job, then potentially resetting the curls, more baking, and finally reapplying fresh pomatum and powder. This would be a significant ongoing expense. For those who couldn't afford frequent professional maintenance, wigs could become quite ripe. A lesser-known tidbit: some frugal individuals would try to refresh their wigs by leaving them out in the frost, believing it helped to kill critters and solidify the grease, making it easier to comb out. Whether this was effective or just wishful thinking is debatable, but it speaks to the desperation. You see a footman emerge from a townhouse, carefully carrying a wig on a block, presumably on its way to the perruquier for a spa day. It looks a little tired, a bit gray rather than pristine white, the curls slightly deflated. It's a reminder that these weren't static objects. They were in a constant cycle of wear, accumulation, and refurbishment. The sheer effort of maintaining this illusion of effortless elegance is quite something. Historians still argue whether the extensive use of powder was driven more by the aesthetic desire for whiteness or by the practical need to manage grease and extend the time between cleanings. It's likely a combination of both, a marriage of vanity and questionable hygiene. The thought of constantly having your head encased in a potentially stiff, greasy, heavily scented structure, then doused in fine powder, makes your own scalp tingle sympathetically. Add to this the fact that you might be wearing it for many hours a day in all sorts of weather. It's a wonder anyone could think straight. It must have been a relief to finally take the thing off at the end of the day, probably with a sigh that would rival the bellows used to powder it. Just imagine the buildup on the inside of the caul. A fragrant, slightly gritty residue of sweat, pomade, and 100 polite conversations. It certainly makes you appreciate the simplicity of just washing your hair. A little bit of gentle ribbing. Perhaps the sheer weight and discomfort of these wigs contributed to the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment. People were so desperate for a distraction. Now, with all that meticulously prepared hair, whether human or from our four-legged friends, and the daily applications of starch-based powders and greasy, fragrant pomatums, you've essentially created a 5-star, all-inclusive resort for some rather unwelcome guests. Yes, we must now turn our attention to the itchy, crawling, ever-present reality of 18th century life. Lice, fleas, and other tiny creatures that found wigs to be exceptionally hospitable environments. This wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a pervasive problem, a torment that transcended social class, though the wealthy perhaps had more resources to throw at it, even if those resources were sometimes misguided. The common head louse, Pediculus humanus capitis, was public enemy number 1. These tiny wingless insects thrive in the warmth and shelter of hair, feeding on minuscule amounts of human blood from the scalp. And what could be more inviting than a dense, often insulated and infrequently deep-cleaned wig? Your own natural hair, especially if kept short or shaved beneath the wig as many did, might offer less prime real estate. But the wig itself became a bustling metropolis for these critters. The pomatum, far from deterring them, likely gave them something to cling to and perhaps even supplemented their diet, though they primarily need blood. The powder, while absorbent, didn't seem to bother them much either. In fact, a well-powdered wig could provide excellent camouflage for nits, lice eggs, and adult lice alike. Delicious. Fleas, too, were no strangers to 18th century households, or indeed 18th century heads. While they might not live on humans in the same way lice do, they certainly enjoyed a good blood meal and could easily hop aboard a passing wig for a quick snack and a sheltered ride. And then there were other, less clearly identified vermin, a general term for any unwanted tiny inhabitants. The combination of natural fibers, accumulated body oils, sweat, powder, and pomatum created a rich, organic environment that was just begging to be colonized. It makes your skin crawl just thinking about it, doesn't it? That phantom itch you sometimes get when someone merely mentions lice. Imagine that feeling, but for real and frequently. The constant itching was, naturally, a major source of discomfort and social awkwardness. While scratching in public was generally frowned upon, the urge could become overwhelming. This led to the invention and widespread use of those elegant wig scratchers we touched on earlier. These were typically long, slender rods made of ivory, silver, or polished wood, often with a delicately carved miniature hand or claw at the end. They allowed the wearer to discreetly, or sometimes not so discreetly depending on the urgency of the itch, slip the implement under the wig to get at the offending spot without dislodging the entire precarious edifice. You might see a gentleman in a coffee house, seemingly deep in conversation, subtly maneuvering his scratcher around the back of his peruke. It was a common sight, a testament to the shared suffering. A quirky tidbit. Some particularly elaborate scratchers even had a small mirror attached, presumably to help locate the source of the itch or perhaps to check if any of the wig's architecture had gone askew during an energetic scratching session. The presence of these pests wasn't just uncomfortable, it also carried a social stigma, even if it was incredibly common. While everyone likely dealt with them to some degree, an obviously infested wig, perhaps with visible lice or nits, would be a source of mortification. Hence, the constant efforts to keep wigs clean and sweet, though these efforts were often fighting a losing battle against the sheer reproductive power of lice in such an ideal habitat. Think about the structure of these wigs, all those dense curls, rolls, and deep crevices, perfect hiding places, perfect egg-laying locations. Cleaning methods, like combing out powder and reapplying pomatum, might remove some adult lice, but the nits, glued firmly to the hair shafts, were much harder to dislodge. Boiling the wig, a more extreme cleaning method, would certainly kill everything, but it could also damage the hair and the foundation, shortening the wig's lifespan. It was a constant trade-off. You observe a lady fanning herself vigorously, her powdered décolletage on full display. Her elaborate hairstyle, likely a combination of her own hair augmented with false pieces and pads, towers impressively. But you also notice her fingers momentarily stray to the nape of her neck, a subtle, almost unconscious little scratch. It's a tiny movement, easily missed, but it speaks volumes. Even the most elegant and composed individuals were not immune. The medical understanding of lice and their transmission was still developing. While people knew lice caused itching and were associated with poor hygiene, the full picture of their life cycle and how easily they spread wasn't always appreciated. Many folk remedies existed, some undoubtedly useless, others perhaps mildly effective, and a few downright dangerous. We'll get to some of those more hazardous treatments later. Historians still argue whether the constant battle with wig-dwelling pests contributed significantly to the eventual decline in wig popularity, or if it was simply an accepted, albeit unpleasant, part of life for those who wore them. It certainly couldn't have helped their appeal in the long run. You'd think after centuries of this, someone would have invented a tiny wig-mounted louse zapper, but alas, 18th century technology hadn't quite reached that level of sophistication. Maybe that's an entrepreneurial idea for a steampunk convention. The very idea of knowingly placing this potential insect haven on your head each morning takes a certain steeling of the nerves. It adds another layer to your understanding of the 18th century mindset, a greater tolerance for things we would find utterly unbearable, a different baseline for personal comfort perhaps. The desire to conform to fashion, to project status, must have been incredibly powerful to override the sheer ick factor of a potentially teeming toupee. Or maybe, like people who live near a constantly noisy railway line, they just got used to the itch. You shudder slightly. Suddenly, a simple beanie seems like the height of hygienic luxury. So you're an 18th century wig enthusiast, or perhaps just someone forced by profession or social standing to wear one, and you're engaged in a constant losing battle against an army of tiny, bloodthirsty lodgers in your luxurious headpiece. The scratchers offer temporary relief, the intermittent professional cleanings a brief armistice, but the enemy always seems to regroup. What's a fashionable yet tormented soul to do? Well, this is where our story takes a rather peculiar and, frankly, quite whisker-twitching turn. The theory of employing live mice as a form of in-wig pest control. Yes, you heard that correctly. We're not talking about a cartoon cat chasing a cartoon mouse. We're talking about the purported practice of carrying small live mice, sometimes in little cages or even allowed to roam freely, or as freely as one can roam in a dense forest of powdered horsehair, within the voluminous confines of a wig. The logic, if you can call it that with a straight face, seems to have been this. Mice, being natural predators of insects, or at least enthusiastic consumers of small organic matter, would theoretically snack on the lice, fleas, nits, and other delightful creepy crawlies that had taken up residence in your wig. The mouse, in this scenario, becomes a tiny, furry, mobile sanitation engineer, diligently working to keep your peruke pest-free. Imagine the scene. A dapper gentleman, resplendent in his full-bottomed wig, attending a society ball. All the while, a small rodent is furtively nibbling away at his unwanted scalp tenants. It's an image that's both utterly bizarre and somehow, in the desperate context of 18th century pest control, almost understandable? Maybe? That's a strong maybe. This mouse in the wig theory is one of those historical oddities that floats around, often repeated as a lurid or amusing anecdote. But its actual prevalence and practicality are subjects of considerable debate among historians. It's the kind of detail that sounds so outrageous it must be true, or at least so outrageous that people want it to be true because it makes for such a wonderfully weird story. Think of it as historical clickbait, 18th century style. You won't believe what they kept in their wigs. Number 3 will shock you. If this practice did occur, it raises a multitude of rather pressing questions. Firstly, the type of mouse. Would it be a wild field mouse, opportunistically captured? Or perhaps a more domesticated, if one can use that term for a wig-dwelling rodent variety? How would one prevent the mouse from, say, escaping at an inopportune moment, perhaps during a crucial business negotiation, or while taking tea with the Dowager Duchess? The social ramifications of a live mouse leaping from your head and scuttling across the fine mahogany table would be, to put it mildly, considerable. Awkward. Then there's the issue of the mouse's own byproducts. While it might be consuming the lice, it would also be producing its own tiny contributions to the wig's ecosystem. One shudders to think of the resulting hygiene implications, swapping one form of infestation for another, arguably more noticeable. 1. A louse is one thing. A mouse pellet gently dislodging and landing on your lace jabot is quite another level of sartorial crisis. The cure in this case might well have been worse or at least smellier than the disease. Despite these glaringly obvious practical difficulties, the idea has a certain rustic charm, a kind of desperate ingenuity. It speaks to a time before readily available chemical pesticides, when people often resorted to biological controls, sometimes with unintended consequences. Think cane toads in Australia, but on a much, much smaller and head-mounted scale. One quirky, though perhaps apocryphal, detail often attached to this story is that some mice were supposedly trained for this purpose, or that particularly small, placid mice were preferred. How one would train a mouse to selectively eat lice and not, for instance, nibble on the actual wig hair or the wearer's ear is a training regimen lost to the mists of time, probably for the best. It's important to approach such colorful historical claims with a degree of skepticism. Often such stories arise from satirical writings of the period, which delighted in exaggerating fashion foibles, or from misunderstandings, or perhaps from isolated eccentric instances that get blown out of proportion and presented as common practice. The 18th century had a robust tradition of caricature and social commentary, and what might have started as a cartoonist's joke about the absurdities of wig wearing could, over time, morph into a historical fact. Historians still argue whether the live mice theory represents a genuine, if rare, pest control method, a misunderstood practice, or simply a durable piece of historical folklore. You picture yourself trying to discreetly feed your wig mouse a tiny crumb of cheese under the table, hoping no one notices its faint squeaks or the rustling in your upper coiffure. It's a mental image that teeters between the comical and the deeply unsettling. Perhaps the constant, subtle movement of a small creature exploring the terrain of your wig might even have been mistaken for, or provided a distraction from, the itching of the lice themselves. Oh, that's not lice, that's just Bartholomew, my trusty wig rodent doing his rounds. The very idea highlights the desperation people felt. When faced with a relentless, itchy, and embarrassing pest problem, and with limited effective solutions, perhaps even the most outlandish ideas gained a fleeting moment of consideration. It's a testament to human ingenuity, or perhaps human gullibility, in the face of persistent discomfort. It certainly makes our modern-day anxieties about split ends seem rather trivial by comparison, doesn't it? As you ponder this, a pigeon lands rather heavily on a window ledge nearby, its claws scrabbling for purchase, a sudden mundane intrusion of the animal kingdom that somehow seems less strange than the idea of one deliberately cultivated inside someone's headwear. The gentle caress of a mouse's whiskers on your scalp, a soothing balm or a fresh horror. The 18th century continues to surprise. So we've dangled the tantalizing, if slightly horrifying prospect of tiny, heroic mice battling armies of lice within the powdered ramparts of 18th century wigs. It's a fantastic image, the kind that makes for a great, you-inducing historical anecdote. But did wig makers, or even wig wearers, actually carry live mice in their pockets, or indeed, within the voluminous depths of their perukes, as a common or even occasional form of pest control? It's time to sift through the historical hay, or should that be horsehair, and see if we can find any actual nibbling evidence for this claim, or if it's just a particularly persistent piece of historical hearsay. The short, and perhaps slightly disappointing answer for those who love a good grotesque historical detail is that concrete, verifiable evidence for the widespread practice of using live mice as wig-dwelling pest controllers is incredibly scarce, verging on non-existent in mainstream historical accounts. You won't find entries in wigmakers' ledgers for rodent wrangling services, or detailed instructions in household management guides on the proper care and feeding of your peruke mouse. While the 18th century certainly had its share of eccentricities and what we might consider bizarre medical or hygienic practices, remember the snail water for coughs, or the liberal use of mercury for, well, almost everything. This particular one seems to lean more towards folklore than fact. Most serious historical research into 18th century wig wearing and wig care focuses on the materials, construction, styling, powdering, pomatums, and the more conventional, though still sometimes alarming, methods of cleaning and pest removal, which we'll explore shortly. The mouse in the wig theory tends to pop up in more anecdotal, less rigorously sourced accounts, often repeated because of its shock value or humorous potential. It's the kind of story that, once heard, is hard to forget, and thus easily passed on, gaining a patina of truth through sheer repetition. Think of it like an urban legend, but from a pre-urban, more wig-centric era. My cousin's hairdresser's great-aunt swore her grandmother's wig-maker kept a special breed of tiny, delousing mice. Where might such a story have originated? As mentioned, satire is a strong contender. The 18th century was a golden age for satirical prints and writings, lampooning every aspect of society, especially the excesses of fashion. The towering wigs, the heavy powder, the obsession with artifice. These were ripe targets. It's entirely plausible that a satirist, wanting to ridicule the absurdity of high fashion and its associated discomforts, like lice, might have invented the idea of mice in wigs as a grotesque exaggeration, a reductio ad absurdum of the lengths people would go to for style. Such an image would certainly have been memorable and highly effective in making its point. Imagine a Rowlandson or Gilray caricature depicting a lady's elaborate coiffure with tiny mice peeking out from the curls, causing chaos at a polite tea party. Another possibility is a misinterpretation or exaggeration of other, less direct associations between mice and wigs. For example, stored wigs, if not kept in secure wig boxes, could certainly attract mice looking for nesting materials, or perhaps remnants of the starch-based powder or greasy pomatum. A wig found with mouse droppings or signs of nibbling wouldn't mean the mouse was employed there. It would mean it was an unwelcome squatter. This mundane reality could, over time and with a bit of imaginative storytelling, transform into the much more exciting narrative of purposeful murine employment. Furthermore, while biological pest control was understood in some agricultural contexts, applying it so directly and intimately to the human body seems like a stretch, even for an era with different notions of personal space and hygiene. The practicalities, as we discussed, the risk of escape, the mouse's own waste, the potential for bites, even from a tiny mouse, would likely have outweighed any dubious benefits in louse reduction. It's also worth noting that cats were common household pets, prized for their mousing abilities. If one had a pest problem, encouraging the cat to deal with actual mice in the house would be far more logical than trying to miniaturize the process onto one's own head. One rather niche fringe theory suggests that perhaps a dead, dried mouse, or parts of one, might have been used as some sort of sachet or amulet within a wig, based on obscure folk beliefs about warding off pests or illness. But even this is highly speculative and lacks substantial backing. Historians still argue whether there might have been isolated, highly eccentric individuals who attempted such a thing, whose strange habits then became exaggerated into a general practice. It's not impossible. History is full of colorful eccentrics. However, to claim it was a recognized or even fringe method used by wig makers or widely adopted by wearers is not supported by the kind of documentary evidence scholars typically rely on. Account books, letters, diaries, medical texts, or professional manuals of the period. Those sources are usually quite detailed about everyday life, and such a peculiar habit would likely have merited a mention, even if only to be ridiculed or advised against. So while the image of a tiny whiskered hero diligently debugging your ducal periwig is undeniably entertaining, it seems more likely to be a product of imaginative embellishment or satirical commentary than a reflection of everyday 18th century reality. It's a bit like the myth that medieval people threw all their rubbish out the window shouting "Gardyloo." While waste disposal was certainly an issue, the overly dramatic, universalized image is an exaggeration. The live mice in wigs story seems to fall into a similar category, a factoid that's more fun than factual. Perhaps the very existence of the story, though, tells us something important. It highlights just how desperate people were for solutions to the relentless problem of wig-infesting pests. So desperate that even such an outlandish idea could gain some traction in the popular imagination. It's a shame, in a way. A tiny powdered mouse in a miniature powdered wig would have made an excellent historical mascot. Given that the idea of employing a dedicated team of highly trained, or even vaguely interested mice to keep your wig free of tiny squatters seems to belong more to the realm of whimsical fiction than historical fact. What did people in the 18th century actually do to combat the inevitable infestations of lice, fleas, and other uninvited guests in their elaborate headwear? They couldn't just ignore the problem, not if they wanted to maintain any semblance of comfort or social standing. The methods they employed were a mixed bag, some practical, some based on folk wisdom, and some, from our modern perspective, rather alarming in their own right. The first and most straightforward line of defense was mechanical removal. This involved meticulous combing of the wig with fine-toothed combs, often made of metal or ivory. This was a painstaking process, especially for densely curled or styled wigs, and aimed to physically dislodge adult lice and as many nits, lice eggs, which are notoriously difficult to remove as they're glued to the hair shafts, as possible. Wig makers would do this when wigs were brought in for servicing, and individuals might attempt it themselves, though it was harder to do thoroughly on one's own head, or rather, one's own wig on a block. You can imagine someone sitting for hours, carefully picking through the strands. It's not unlike the knit combing that parents still, with grim dedication, perform on their children today, just on a much grander powdered scale. Boiling was another, more drastic option for cleaning and delousing wigs. Submerging the entire wig in boiling water would certainly kill any live lice and their eggs. However, this was a harsh treatment for the hair itself. Remember, it could be human, horse, or goat hair. And for the foundation of the wig, frequent boiling could make the hair brittle, cause it to lose its curl, and potentially damage the caul. So, while effective for sterilization, it was a method used sparingly, perhaps reserved for particularly dire infestations or for cheaper, more robust wigs that could withstand such rough handling. Think of it as the nuclear option in wig hygiene. For day-to-day management, and in an attempt to repel pests, various substances were applied to the wigs or to the scalp beneath. We've already mentioned pomatum and powder. While pomatum, that greasy lard-based concoction, might have inadvertently made it easier for lice to cling on, some of the aromatic ingredients incorporated into it, like lavender, rosemary, or cedarwood oil, were traditionally believed to have insect-repellent properties. Whether they were potent enough in the concentrations used to actually deter a determined louse is debatable, but it was hoped they might at least make the environment less appealing. This is a mainstream historical fact. Aromatic herbs have been used for centuries in attempts to repel insects, long before synthetic pesticides were invented. Burning dried rosemary in a room, for instance, was a common practice to cleanse the air and keep insects away. More potent and often more dangerous substances were also employed. Mercury compounds, believe it or not, were a common ingredient in some ointments and powders used to treat lice, both on the scalp and potentially in wigs if one dared. Mercuric oxide, or white precipitate, was sometimes recommended. While mercury is indeed toxic to lice, it's also highly toxic to humans, easily absorbed through the skin, and can cause severe health problems, including neurological damage. The cure in this case could literally be worse than the disease. Arsenic, another readily available poison, also featured in some anti-louse preparations. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase drop-dead gorgeous, doesn't it? Stavesacre, seeds of Delphinium staphysagria, was a botanical remedy that had some genuine efficacy. The seeds, when crushed and mixed into an ointment or tincture, were known to kill lice. This was a relatively less harmful option than mercury or arsenic, though it could still cause skin irritation in some individuals. Tobacco infusions were also used, as nicotine is a natural insecticide. One can only imagine the aroma of a wig treated with stale tobacco juice and scented pomatum. Truly a fragrance to remember. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of these often toxic treatments outweighed their known risks, or if people were simply desperate and operating with limited medical knowledge. Given the alternatives, like constant maddening itching, perhaps the risk seemed worth it to some. Beyond topical applications, some practices focused on the environment of the wig when not in use. Wigs were often stored in specially made wooden wig boxes. These boxes helped to protect the wig from dust and damage, but some also believed that certain types of wood, like cedar, had inherent pest-repelling qualities, which might have offered some slight additional protection. Another, perhaps more practical approach when a wig was heavily infested and cleaning was too costly or time-consuming was simply to get a new wig and burn the old one. Disposal by fire was a surefire way to eradicate the pest problem from that particular source, though it was obviously an expensive solution. A quirky or fringe tidbit regarding pest control involved fumigation. Some wig makers might have employed sulfur fumes by burning brimstone to disinfect wigs. Sulfur dioxide is a potent fumigant and would certainly kill lice, but it would also leave a distinct, pungent smell and could be damaging to the hair fibers if not done carefully. Imagine retrieving your newly serviced wig, hoping for a fresh, fragrant aroma, and instead getting a whiff of rotten eggs. "Ah, a thorough delousing, I presume," you'd say, trying to keep a straight face. So, while the image of a mouse bravely patrolling your peruke is an amusing one, the reality of 18th century wig pest control was a combination of tedious mechanical cleaning, sometimes harsh chemical treatments, and hopeful reliance on aromatic herbs. It was an ongoing struggle, a testament to the resilience of both the wig wearers and the lice they hosted. You see a well-dressed gentleman pause by a shop window, his hand instinctively going to the back of his wig, a slight frown creasing his brow. The battle, it seems, is never truly won. It makes you wonder if the sudden gusts of wind that sometimes dislodged these towering creations were seen not just as embarrassing, but also as a brief, if public, opportunity for a really good uninhibited scratch. We've talked about the lice, the mice, or lack thereof, the meticulous construction, and the daily powder storms. But beyond the itchy scalp and the sheer faff of it all, were there other, perhaps more insidious perils associated with the powders, pastes, and general culture of 18th century wig wearing? Oh, indeed. The pursuit of follicular fashion came with its own set of occupational hazards for the wig makers and potential health risks for the wearers. often stemming directly from the very materials and practices designed to achieve that perfect, if artificial, look. Let's start with the powder, that ubiquitous white dust, essential for the fashionable pallor of the wig, was typically starch-based, as we've noted, wheat, rice, or potato flour being common. While starch itself is harmless if ingested, inhaling fine particulate matter day in and day out is generally not recommended for good lung health. For the wig wearers, particularly those who had their wigs powdered daily by a valet or maid in a confined powdering closet, the exposure could be significant. They often used cones to cover their faces, but some inhalation was inevitable. This could lead to respiratory irritation, coughing, and potentially more serious lung conditions over time, especially for those with pre-existing sensitivities. Think of it as a low-grade chronic exposure to something akin to baker's lung or farmer's lung, but in the name of style. For the wig makers themselves, and their apprentices who often did the less glamorous prep work, the exposure was even greater. They were constantly handling, processing, and styling hair, often in poorly ventilated workshops. The air in these spaces would have been thick not just with hair dust, but also with the fumes from bleaching agents like sulfur dioxide, used to lighten darker hair, and the powders used for finishing. Chronic exposure to sulfur dioxide can cause bronchitis, asthma-like symptoms, and long-term lung damage. And then there was the fine hair dust itself. Constantly inhaling tiny particles of human and animal hair could lead to a condition known as hairdresser's lung, a type of occupational asthma or hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So, crafting those beautiful perukes could come at a steep personal cost to the artisans. The pomatums and pastes used to style the wigs and help the powder adhere also presented their own set of issues. As we know, these were often made from rendered animal fats, lard, tallow, bear grease. If not prepared or stored correctly, or if kept on the wig for too long in warm conditions, these organic substances could go rancid. A rancid pomatum would not only smell appalling, even the strongest perfumes would struggle to mask that particular aroma, but could also become a breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Applying this to the scalp or having it in close proximity to the skin for extended periods could lead to skin irritations, infections, rashes, and a generally unpleasant, greasy buildup. Imagine the joy of developing a lovely fungal infection under your expensive high-fashion wig. A rather unfortunate mainstream historical fact is that basic sanitation and understanding of germ theory were still very rudimentary in the 18th century, making such occurrences more likely. And then there were the more overtly toxic ingredients. We've touched upon the use of mercury and arsenic in some anti-louse preparations. If these weren't thoroughly removed, or if they were part of a pomatum recipe, some medicated pomades might have included them, then the wearer was getting a regular direct dose of heavy metal poisoning through skin absorption. Symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning include tremors, memory problems, irritability, and kidney damage. Arsenic poisoning can lead to skin lesions, digestive issues, and various cancers. It's a chilling thought that the very thing intended to enhance one's appearance and social standing could be slowly poisoning you. Historians still argue whether the documented cases of Mad Hatters who used mercury in felt production have parallels with wig makers, or wearers experiencing similar neurotoxic effects from mercury-laced wig treatments, though direct evidence is often elusive. Lead was another dangerous substance lurking in the 18th century cosmetic and hairdressing toolkit. White lead, lead carbonate, was sometimes used as a component in face powders to achieve a fashionable pale complexion. and it's plausible that lead-based pigments might have occasionally found their way into wig powders or dyes meant to achieve certain shades or sheens, especially for theatrical wigs or those aiming for a particularly brilliant white. Lead is a cumulative poison, affecting multiple body systems, especially the nervous system, and is particularly harmful to children. While perhaps not a primary ingredient in everyday wig powder, its presence in the broader cosmetic environment meant potential for accidental contamination or inclusion. Even the physical weight and structure of some of the more extreme wigs could cause problems. Those towering creations, laden with hair, pomatum, and powder, were not lightweight. Constantly wearing a heavy wig could lead to neck strain and headaches. Moreover, the tight fit of some wig foundations, necessary to keep the edifice secure, could restrict blood flow to the scalp or cause tension headaches. Imagine trying to maintain an elegant posture with several pounds of expertly coiffed animal hair balanced on your head, all while trying to ignore the resident lice and the subtle scent of rancid bear grease. It's a recipe for a sore neck and a grumpy disposition. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the potential fire hazard. Wigs, being made of hair, which is flammable, and often treated with greasy pomatums, also flammable, and fine combustible powders, could pose a fire risk if exposed to open flames, such as candles or fireplaces, which were ubiquitous in 18th century homes and public spaces. While perhaps not a common occurrence, the image of a wig catching fire at a dinner party is both alarming and darkly comical. One imagines guests frantically beating out the flames with napkins, sending showers of sparks and singed powder everywhere. It would certainly put a damper on the soiree. The pursuit of fashion throughout history has often involved uncomfortable and sometimes downright dangerous practices. From a 21st century perspective, the laundry list of potential health hazards associated with 18th century wigs seems rather daunting. It makes you appreciate the relative safety and simplicity of modern hair care, doesn't it? Though arguably, some modern beauty treatments probably have their own yet to be fully understood long-term consequences. We just haven't had 200 years to figure them out yet. Perhaps future generations will look back on our microplastics and hair dyes with the same horrified amusement. Stepping into the workshop of an 18th century wig maker, or perruquier, you're entering a realm of highly specialized craftsmanship, a place where art, commerce, and a fair bit of pungent aroma coalesced. What was daily life like for these artisans who painstakingly transformed raw hair into the towering symbols of status and fashion? And where did they stand in the social hierarchy of the bustling 18th century city? It was a profession that demanded skill, patience, and a strong constitution, navigating a world of discerning clients and, of course, the ever-present challenge of sourcing quality materials. The day for a wig maker, particularly a master craftsman with his own shop, would likely start early. There were wigs to be finished, orders to be reviewed, and perhaps raw hair deliveries to be inspected. Apprentices, often young boys indentured for several years to learn the trade, would be responsible for the more menial tasks. Sweeping the workshop, a never-ending job given the amount of hair and powder flying around. Cleaning tools, boiling and preparing raw hair, running errands, and perhaps practicing basic knotting techniques on scraps or training blocks. It was a hands-on education, learning by doing, often under the strict eye of the master. The air in the workshop, as we've hinted, would be a unique blend. The dry scent of hair, the sweet or spicy notes of perfumes and pomatums, the slightly acrid tang of bleaching agents if hair was being processed, and perhaps the underlying warmth from the ovens used to bake and set curls. You'd probably get used to it, but it would definitely be an acquired smell, like a peculiar bakery that specializes in hair-based confections. A significant part of the wig maker's day would involve consultations with clients. A gentleman wishing to commission a new peruke would need to be measured. The wig maker would take precise measurements of his head to ensure the caul, the wig's foundation, would fit snugly and comfortably. They would discuss styles. Did the client favor the full-bottomed majesty of a court wig, the more practical elegance of a tie wig, or perhaps something daringly fashionable like a towering macaroni creation? Color would be considered, though powdering often standardized the final look, as would the quality of hair, which directly impacted the price. These interactions required not just technical skill, but also a good dose of diplomacy and salesmanship. A successful wig maker needed to be up to date on the latest trends from Paris and London, able to advise his clients on what was a la mode. Think of him as a kind of hair couturier. The actual construction of the wig, the meticulous knotting of thousands of individual hair strands onto the net or ribbon foundation, the careful blending of different hair types or colors, the shaping and curling, was incredibly labor-intensive. A single high-quality wig could take many days, even weeks, to complete. While apprentices handled some preparatory work, the master craftsman would typically undertake the most skilled tasks, particularly the final styling and finishing. He'd work with wig blocks made of wood, shaped like human heads, upon which the wigs were built and styled. His tools would include various combs, hackles for drawing hair, curling irons, tongs heated in a charcoal brazier or over a small flame, scissors, and pots of pomatum. The dexterity and artistic eye required were considerable. It wasn't just about attaching hair, it was about sculpting it, creating volume, flow, and the correct silhouette. Beyond creating new wigs, a large part of the business involved maintenance and repair. Wigs, as we know, needed regular cleaning, repowdering, and redressing to keep them looking their best, and to manage those pesky lice. Clients would send their wigs back to the maker for the servicing. This provided a steady stream of income. The process might involve carefully combing out old powder and pomatum, resetting curls using the heated curlers and baking oven, and then applying fresh pomatum and a new coat of powder. This refurbishment work could be just as skilled as creating a new piece. One historical fact: many wig makers advertised their skills not only in wig making, but also in wig dressing and wig cutting, highlighting their ability to maintain and restyle existing pieces. Socially, wig makers occupied a respectable, if not aristocratic, position. They were skilled tradesmen, often belonging to guilds that regulated the craft and upheld standards. A successful master wig maker, particularly one patronized by the wealthy or influential, could achieve a comfortable standard of living and a degree of social standing within the urban middle class. Their shops were often located in fashionable districts, close to their clientele. However, like many trades, there was a hierarchy. A master with a thriving business and royal appointments was a world away from a journeyman wig maker struggling to find consistent work, or an apprentice toiling away for little more than room and board. Historians still argue whether the rise of the wig maker as a prominent urban artisan reflected a broader societal shift towards valuing specialized craftsmanship during the Enlightenment period, or if their status was purely a reflection of the immense demand for their particular product. Life wasn't without its challenges. Sourcing good quality hair at reasonable prices was a constant concern. Fluctuations in fashion could also impact business. A sudden shift towards simpler styles might mean less demand for the more elaborate and profitable creations. And of course, there was competition from other wig makers. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the occasional shady practices within the trade. Some less scrupulous wig makers might try to pass off lower quality animal hair as human hair, or use shortcuts in construction. The guilds often tried to police such behavior, but as in any trade, not everyone played by the rules. Imagine the scandal if it was discovered that Lord Flibbertigibbet's magnificent peruke was actually mostly goat. The horror! The day would likely end with the shop being tidied, tools cleaned and put away, and perhaps accounts being settled. The wig maker might then retire upstairs if he lived above his shop, as many tradesmen did, his head perhaps full of the latest styles from Paris, or worrying about a delayed shipment of prime Silesian horsehair. It was a life immersed in the world of hair, fashion, and the constant pursuit of that perfectly coiffed illusion that defined so much of 18th century society. You see a young apprentice sweeping a small mountain of hair clippings and powder dust out into the gutter at the end of the day, his face smudged, looking weary but perhaps with a glimmer of pride in the intricate creations taking shape within the workshop. It's a craft that, for all its oddities, required true artistry and dedication. All good, or at least very hairy things must come to an end. And so it was with the reign of the mighty wig. After dominating European fashion for the better part of a century and a half, the elaborate powdered creations that had once been the absolute pinnacle of style began a slow but steady decline in popularity as the 18th century drew to a close and the 19th century dawned. Several converging factors, social, political, economic, and aesthetic, contributed to fashion's great fall from the head, leading people to, quite literally, let their own hair down. One of the most significant catalysts for this change was the French Revolution, which erupted in 1789. The revolution wasn't just about overthrowing the monarchy. It was a profound societal upheaval that challenged aristocratic privilege and the very symbols associated with it. And what was a more visible, more potent symbol of the Ancien Regime than the elaborate powdered wig? It reeked of extravagance, leisure, and the old order. As revolutionary fervor swept through France and its ideals spread across Europe, ostentatious displays of wealth and aristocracy became not just unfashionable, but actively dangerous. Wearing a powdered wig could mark you as a sympathizer with the deposed elite, a rather perilous position to be in during the Reign of Terror. Suddenly, simplicity and a more natural appearance were seen as virtuous, aligning with Republican ideals. Think of it as an extreme form of cancel culture, where your hairstyle could quite literally cost you your head. This anti-aristocratic sentiment found sartorial expression in a move towards more practical, less ornate clothing and hairstyles for men. Hair began to be worn shorter, often in styles inspired by classical antiquity. Think of the Roman Emperor Titus cut, which was seen as more democratic and less frivolous. Powder, too, fell out of favor, partly due to its aristocratic associations, and partly due to a new tax levied on hair powder in Britain in 1795 by William Pitt's government to help fund the wars against France. This hair powder tax made the daily ritual of powdering significantly more expensive and inconvenient, accelerating its demise as a widespread fashion. Suddenly, that dusty cloud in the powdering closet seemed less like a mark of elegance and more like a drain on the purse. A mainstream historical fact, this tax was quite effective in curtailing the use of hair powder and, by extension, elaborate wig styles. Many men simply opted to go without rather than pay the duty. Beyond the political and economic pressures, there was also a broader shift in aesthetic sensibilities, part of the transition from the Rococo and Neoclassical periods to the burgeoning Romantic movement. Romanticism, with its emphasis on nature, individualism, and emotion, favored a more natural, less artificial look. The stiff, sculpted, powdered creations of the mid-18th century seemed increasingly out of step with this new spirit. Flowing, artfully disheveled natural hair for both men and women became the ideal. Think of the portraits of romantic poets with their windswept locks, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of a full-bottomed periwig. The cult of sensibility, which valued authentic feeling over courtly artifice, also played a role. Your hair was meant to reflect your inner state, not a wig-maker's skill. For women, while towering and elaborate hairstyles had also been fashionable, particularly in the latter half of the 18th century, think the pouf and the calash bonnet to protect it. These often involved dressing the natural hair, augmented with false hair pieces and pads, rather than full wigs in the way men wore them. However, women's hairstyles also simplified dramatically around the turn of the century, embracing softer, more classical lines inspired by Greek and Roman statues, with curls often framing the face rather than being piled high. The practical discomforts and hygiene challenges associated with wig wearing, which we have explored in such itchy detail, likely also contributed to their decline once the social pressure to wear them lessened. While people may have tolerated the lice, the grease, the powder, and the expense when wigs were the height of fashion and a symbol of status, these drawbacks probably seemed less acceptable when wigs started to look old-fashioned or politically suspect. Who wants to endure an itchy, pest-ridden headpiece if it also makes you look like a relic from a bygone era or, worse, a counter-revolutionary? Historians still argue whether the hygiene fatigue played a primary role in the wig's decline, or if it was merely a secondary factor that made abandoning the fashion easier once other pressures mounted. Even the very materials and methods of wig making, like the reliance on pomatum and powder, started to seem dated and, frankly, a bit messy compared to emerging hair care notions. As the 19th century progressed, ideas about personal cleanliness began to slowly shift, with more emphasis, eventually, on washing hair, even if truly effective shampoos were still some way off. The caked-on layers of old pomade and starch just didn't fit with this slowly evolving sensibility. You can picture the scene, a once thriving wig maker's shop in the early 1800s. The rows of wig blocks might still be there, but perhaps fewer of them are adorned with new creations. The orders for full-bottomed perukes and elaborate Ramillies wigs are dwindling, replaced, if at all, by requests for smaller, more discreet hairpieces or toupees to cover baldness, rather than as grand fashion statements. The apprentices might be spending more time sweeping up cobwebs than hair clippings. A quirky, rather sad fringe tidbit might be the image of wig makers trying to adapt, perhaps advertising new, revolutionary, unpowdered styles, or offering deep discounts on their now obsolete powdered stock. Get your Louis XV periwig now 70% off, perfect for costume parties or frightening pigeons. The decline wasn't instantaneous, of course. Certain professions, notably law, barristers and judges in Britain and some Commonwealth countries, and some clergy, retained wigs as part of their formal attire, a tradition that continues, rather anachronistically, to this day in some places. But for the general populace, the age of the fashionable wig was well and truly over by the early decades of the 19th century. The streets were no longer filled with those towering powdered monuments to hair. Fashion had moved on, leaving behind a legacy of intricate craftsmanship, itchy memories, and perhaps a few forgotten mice in attic-bound wig boxes. The air in the cities gradually lost that pervasive scent of hair powder, replaced by the more industrial aromas of the approaching century. The silence in the former powdering closets must have been deafening. We've journeyed through the rise and fall of the magnificent 18th century wig, explored its construction, its daily upkeep, its unwelcome inhabitants, and the surprising reasons people endured it all. But now, let's circle back to that most peculiar and persistent question, the one that likely drew you into this whole hairy saga, the live mice in the wigs. Was it a genuine, if bizarre, pest control tactic, a satirical exaggeration, or simply a misunderstanding that took on a life of its own? This is where we delve into the fascinating and often frustrating world of historical debate, where a lack of definitive evidence allows for multiple interpretations and a good deal of scholarly head-scratching, perhaps with a tiny ivory wig scratcher. As we've already established, concrete primary source evidence proving that wig makers routinely supplied, or wearers regularly employed, live mice as mobile louse hunters is remarkably thin on the ground. You don't find wig makers' account books itemizing 2 small gray mice for louse patrol sixpence, nor do personal diaries from the period nonchalantly mention, "Slightly vexed today, my wig mouse Bartholomew made a rather public escape during sherry with the vicar." The absence of such direct contemporary documentation is a significant challenge for proponents of the theory. Historians who are skeptical of the literal mouse in the wig practice often point to this lack of corroborating evidence as their primary argument. They suggest that if such a practice were even remotely common, it would surely have been noted, commented upon, or even regulated, given its rather public and potentially disruptive nature. So, where does the idea come from and why does it persist? One strong possibility, as previously mentioned, lies in the rich vein of 18th century satire. Caricaturists like Hogarth, Rowlandson, and Gilray were masters at exaggerating the foibles and fashions of their time. The towering, unnatural wigs were a frequent target of their biting wit. It's entirely plausible that a satirical print or a comedic essay might have depicted or described mice nesting in these elaborate hairdos as a way to mock their absurdity and the questionable hygiene often associated with them. Such an image, being both shocking and memorable, could easily have been taken literally over time, especially as the social context and satirical intent faded from common knowledge. Historians still argue whether some well-known satirical depictions of vermin in wigs were intended as literal representations or as allegorical critiques of societal pests hidden beneath a veneer of fashion. Another line of argument suggests a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of actual, more mundane occurrences. Wigs, especially if stored improperly in boxes or chests, or if left unattended for long periods, perhaps belonging to someone less fastidious or too poor for regular maintenance, could certainly have attracted real mice seeking nesting material, the soft hair and foundation, or food, remnants of starch-based powder, or greasy pomatum. Discovering mouse droppings or a gnawed patch in an old wig doesn't imply the mouse was an employee. It simply means it was an opportunistic squatter. These isolated incidents, perhaps recounted with a bit of dramatic flair, could have evolved into the more elaborate story of deliberately harbored mice. My great-aunt found a mouse nest in her grandam's peruke. Could morph, through generations of retelling, into, they used to keep mice in their wigs to eat the lice. Then there's the human tendency to believe and repeat sensational or grotesque stories, especially about the past. The U factor of live mice in wigs makes it a compelling, if unsettling, narrative. It fits a certain popular perception of previous eras as being universally crude and unhygienic. Such stories often become historical fun facts that are widely circulated without rigorous verification. The weirder the detail, the more likely it is to stick in the public imagination. It's like that persistent myth about Roman vomitoriums being rooms for actual vomiting after feasts. They were just passages for exiting amphitheaters, but the grosser version is more memorable, right? However, it's also important not to entirely dismiss the possibility of very isolated, eccentric instances. Could some individual, desperate to combat a relentless lice problem and perhaps influenced by folk beliefs about animals or with a particularly inventive, if misguided, turn of mind, have tried this? It's not entirely outside the realm of human strangeness, but a few highly eccentric, unrecorded experiments would not constitute a common practice or a method used by wig makers. The debate also touches on the interpretation of ambiguous historical language. Sometimes period texts might refer to vermin in wigs in a general sense. If mice were occasional unwelcome invaders of stored wigs, the lines could blur over time in secondary or tertiary accounts. A writer centuries later might misinterpret a vague reference to pests and seize upon the most dramatic possibility. This is where meticulous linguistic analysis and cross-referencing with other contemporary sources become crucial for historians trying to untangle fact from folklore. Ultimately, the case for live mice being deliberately carried in 18th century wigs as a pest control strategy remains largely unproven and leans heavily towards myth or satirical invention. The overwhelming focus in reliable historical sources is on other, more conventional, if not always effective or safe methods, like combing, boiling, and various topical treatments. The silence in those records about purpose-kept mice is rather telling. It's a wonderfully vivid and memorable image, a testament to our fascination with the more bizarre corners of history, but probably not something that happened with any regularity, if at all, on the powdered heads of 18th century society. So you can probably rest easy, knowing your own hair isn't missing out on a crucial, rodent-based delousing service. Though it does make you wonder what peculiar myths about our current habits future historians might concoct. Did they really stare into glowing rectangles for hours on end? And what was the purpose of the tiny domesticated barking creatures they kept in their homes? Though the reign of the full powdered wig as a ubiquitous fashion statement ended with the societal shifts around the turn of the 19th century, its influence didn't simply vanish into thin air, like a dissipating cloud of hair powder. The 18th century wig, in its myriad forms, has left a surprisingly lasting legacy, echoing in our legal systems, our language, our cultural perceptions of a particular historical period, and even in the very idea of artificial hair enhancements today. It's more than just a quaint historical artifact. It's a cultural touchstone that continues to resonate in some rather unexpected ways. Perhaps the most visible and enduring legacy of the 18th century wig is found in the legal profession, specifically in the United Kingdom and some Commonwealth nations. Barristers and judges in these jurisdictions still to this day wear wigs as part of their court attire. These modern legal wigs, usually shorter, more stylized, and often made of horsehair, are direct descendants of the perukes worn by their 18th century counterparts. While the style has evolved, the tradition itself is a powerful link to the past, intended to convey authority, impartiality, and the historical gravitas of the law. For many, it's a symbol of the continuity of the legal system. For others, it's an anachronism, a slightly baffling relic in the 21st century. But regardless of one's opinion, the sight of a bewigged barrister instantly evokes that historical connection. One can't help but feel a faint echo of those earlier gentlemen of the law, perhaps scratching discreetly beneath their forensically powdered horsehair. The language we use today also carries faint traces of the age of wigs. Phrases like bigwig, used to describe an important or influential person, directly harken back to the era when larger, more elaborate wigs signified higher status. Someone who was a big wig was literally wearing a wig that proclaimed their importance. Similarly, the admonition to keep your hair on when telling someone to remain calm might subtly, though less directly, relate to the frustration and potential for a wig to become dislodged during moments of agitation. While the direct etymological link is debated by linguists, the imagery connects. Even terms related to falseness or artificiality in appearance can sometimes subtly evoke the era of elaborate hairpieces. Historians still argue whether the persistence of such linguistic relics indicates a deep cultural imprint or merely the catchy nature of certain idiomatic expressions. Culturally, the 18th century wig has become an almost instant visual shorthand for the entire period, particularly its aristocratic and formal aspects. When you see a film, a play, or even a cartoon set in the 1700s, powdered wigs are practically a default costume element, immediately signaling the era to the audience. Think of depictions of figures like George Washington, Mozart, or Marie Antoinette. The wig is often a defining feature of their popular image. This iconic status means the wig often carries with it a whole host of associated connotations: elegance, formality, but also sometimes decadence, artificiality, and social rigidity, depending on the context. It's a powerful symbol, capable of evoking a complex range of historical associations with a single glance. Remember the slightly stuffy, almost theatrical posture we noted people adopted when wearing grand wigs? That visual has been burned into our collective cultural memory. The very idea of artificial hair enhancements, while existing in many forms throughout history, long before and long after the 18th century, perhaps received a certain normalization, or at least a period of intense focus during the heyday of the wig. The skill and artistry developed by 18th century wig makers in working with false hair, blending it, styling it, and creating convincing illusions laid groundwork for future developments in hairpieces, toupees, and eventually modern extensions and wigs. While materials and techniques have evolved dramatically, thankfully we're no longer reliant on bear grease and plaster of Paris. The fundamental concept of using artificial hair to alter one's appearance, to achieve a desired aesthetic, or to conceal hair loss owes a debt to this period of intense follicular creativity. A quirky fringe tidbit. Early patents for improved wig constructions and attachment methods began to appear even as the fashion was waning, showing an ongoing interest in refining the technology of artificial hair, even if its daily universal use was declining. Furthermore, the wig of the 18th century sometimes appears in fashion revivals, or as an avant-garde statement. High-fashion designers occasionally draw inspiration from historical silhouettes and styles, and the dramatic forms of 18th century wigs can provide a rich source of ideas for bold, theatrical looks on the runway. While not intended for everyday wear, these reinterpretations keep the memory of the historical wig alive in contemporary aesthetic conversations, reminding us of a time when hair was quite literally an architectural art form. And what about those live mice? While likely a myth in terms of actual pest control, the very persistence of the story contributes to the wig's slightly notorious and fascinating legacy. It adds a layer of grotesque intrigue, a shiver of, did they really do that? Which keeps the period feeling vivid and slightly unsettling. It ensures that our mental image of the 18th century wig isn't just one of pristine powder and elegant curls, but also hints at the grimier, itchier realities that lay beneath. So while you're unlikely to see your local barista sporting a full-bottomed periwig anytime soon, unless it's a very specific themed coffee shop, The echoes of this once ubiquitous accessory are still around us. From the solemnity of the courtroom to the slang we use, from our mental picture of historical figures to the ongoing quest for the perfect hairstyle, natural or otherwise, the 18th century wig has left an indelible mark. It stands as a testament to the power of fashion to shape not just appearance, but also social structures, professions, and even our collective memory. It's a reminder that even the most seemingly frivolous aspects of human culture can have surprisingly deep roots and a long, often rather hairy, afterlife. And so, as the imaginary candlelight flickers low and the bustling sounds of the 18th century street begin to fade into a distant murmur in your mind, our rather hairy exploration of wigs, wig makers, and the curious case of the pocket-dwelling, or perhaps not-so-dwelling mice, draws to its gentle close. We've journeyed from the royal courts of France, where fashion dictated towering tresses, to the humble workshops where artisans painstakingly knotted and curled, and into the very real, very itchy struggles of daily life beneath those powdered monuments. You've mentally navigated cobblestone streets, inhaled the phantom scents of pomatum and street vendor fare, and perhaps even felt a sympathetic itch at the mere thought of those ubiquitous lice. We've seen how these elaborate coiffures were so much more than just a covering for the head. They were declarations of status, tools of professional identity, and even, surprisingly, a peculiar form of hygiene in an era that had a very different relationship with cleanliness than our own. You've pondered the immense industry required to source the sheer tonnage of human and animal hair. A global trade built on the need to adorn the heads of Europe's fashionable elite. Remember the young peasant girls selling their locks, the blend of horse and goat hair, the pungent bleaching processes, all a world away from the serene elegance the final product was meant to project. The daily ritual of powdering, the carefully constructed curls baked into permanence, the constant battle against wig-dwelling pests using everything from fine-toothed combs to rather alarming concoctions of mercury and arsenic. It all paints a picture of dedication, and perhaps a touch of desperation, in the pursuit of appearing a la mode. The little ivory scratchers, elegant tools for an inelegant problem, seem to symbolize so much of that era's approach to discomfort. Deal with it stylishly if possible. And then, of course, there were the mice. That wonderfully bizarre, enduring image of tiny rodents acting as mobile pest controllers within the very structure of the wig. While our investigation suggests this was more likely a product of satire, misunderstanding, or folklore rather than a widespread practice, the very persistence of the story tells us something important. It highlights the sheer magnitude of the pest problem, the lengths to which people might have imagined going, and our own enduring fascination with the grotesque and peculiar aspects of history. It's a tale that makes the past feel both incredibly strange, and yet, in its human inventiveness, or human gullibility, somehow relatable. You can almost hear the faint apocryphal squeak even now, a tiny footnote in the grand opera of 18th century fashion. We've considered the health hazards too, the lungfuls of powder, the potentially rancid pomatums, the toxic treatments. It's a sobering reminder that fashion, throughout the ages, has often demanded a price beyond mere monetary cost, sometimes paid in comfort, and sometimes in health. The life of the wig maker, a skilled artisan caught between the demands of high society and the often unpleasant realities of his materials, unfolds as a testament to a bygone craft, a world of apprentices learning by feel, and master craftsmen shaping societal perceptions one curl at a time. The eventual decline of the wig, spurred by revolution, taxes, and shifting aesthetic ideals, was not just a change in hairstyle, but a reflection of deeper societal transformations. As powdered heads bowed to natural locks, it signaled a broader move away from aristocratic artifice towards a new emphasis on individualism and a different kind of authenticity. Yet, as we've seen, the wig's legacy endures, in our courtrooms, in our language, in our enduring cultural image of that flamboyant and fascinating century. It reminds us that even the most ephemeral of fashions can leave surprisingly deep indentations on the fabric of history. So, as you drift further towards the edge of wakefulness, let the images of those grand, precarious, and often problematic perukes soften and recede. The scratching, the powdering, the endless pursuit of follicular perfection can all fade away now. The societal pressures, the intricate etiquette, the sheer daily effort of it all. You can release that. Think instead, perhaps, of the quiet satisfaction of finally removing that heavy, itchy edifice at the end of a long day. The simple relief of a bare head meeting cool air. That, at least, is a sensation that transcends centuries. The world of 18th century wigs, with all its curious details and olfactory challenges, can now settle into the quiet archives of your mind. A story told, a journey completed. The whispers of the past grow fainter now, blending with the gentle sounds of your own peaceful surroundings. The elaborate structures of hair give way to the simpler, softer textures of your pillow, and the slight anxieties of another era dissolve into the calm of the present moment. There are no more lice to worry about here, no powder to inhale, no pressing need to decide between a Ramillies tie or a full-bottomed peruke. Only quiet and rest. The distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones is now just a gentle, rhythmic tapping, far, far away. The concerns of status, the meticulous rules of societal presentation, the endless fuss with powders and pomatums, all these feel heavy, like clothes worn for far too long, and now they are being shed, garment by garment, layer by layer, until only the simplest, most comfortable ease remains. Let the image of those grand wigs, once so important, so commanding of attention, simply dissolve. See them perhaps float away like in dandelion seeds on a gentle breeze, becoming smaller and smaller, losing their intricate forms until they are just a soft blur against a peaceful, darkening sky. There is no need to analyze their construction any further. No need to debate the truth of mice as pest controllers. No need to consider the sourcing of the hair or the lives of the wig makers. All that intricate detail can just unravel, like a loosely spun thread, leaving behind only a sense of quiet understanding, a gentle appreciation for a time now long past. The bustling energy of that 18th century city street, with its vendors and its fine ladies and its bewigged gentlemen, is quieting down. The shops are closing, the lanterns are being lit, casting long, soft shadows. The sounds become more muted, more spread out, until only a profound sense of stillness prevails. You can let go of the narrative now, let go of the listening, and allow yourself to drift on the peaceful current that carries you towards sleep. The only task remaining is to rest, to allow your own mind to become as smooth and untroubled as a still pond at twilight. Sweet dreams.